The fire had been built back up to a roaring blaze. The boys had slept for several hours, awakening around 11 o'clock. They were now preparing their breakfast lunch over the open flames, toasting bacon and biscuits on sticks. While the fire sizzled and popped and the boys munched and chewed, another sound rose up from among the din, the sound of a hammer striking metal. One of the boys, Gisli, the hammer-handed, had produced a small portable anvil from his satchel and was currently beating iron strips into shape. Red-hot sparks scattered with every blow from his ball-peen hammer. At that moment he was forging new horseshoes to replace the ones that had been thrown during the chase. He was also hammering new nails to fasten them to the pony's hooves as well. Once he was done beating the metal into shape, he plunked the glowing object into a bucket of cold water. The water hissed and boiled each time a new shoe was dropped in. Gisli had completed 30 shoes already, but he had at least 20 more to go. The hunt for Algar had been long and over rough ground. Myra and Asa watched Gisli work. They were fascinated at how he was able to work so quickly and yet so precisely at the same time. Each shoe took around 5 minutes, requiring no more than 2 heatings in the heart of the fire. Amazing, mused Myra. This, asked Gisli, indicating the glowing iron with his hammer. This is nothing. You should see my father and elder brothers at work. I make no boast when I say that they can forge an army's worth of swords, spearheads, axe blades and CXS in less than 3 days. How many swords have you made? Asked Asa. None, replied Gisli, resuming his hammering. None, echoed Myra. I am forbidden from doing so, said Gisli. I am not yet of age and I am still a member of the fur. We are forbidden from using steel and iron against the other fur, lest we hurt or kill ourselves by mistake. That is why we fight using wooden swords. He motioned to the wooden sword that lay by his feet, partly concealed by the thick springy grass. Myra nodded at the logic of this, but then she noticed that some of the boys had bows strung over their shoulders and quivers of arrows hanging from their belts. What about them? Asked Myra, pointing at the bowmen. How do they not kill anyone? Gisli chuckled and called to one of the bowmen in his native tongue. The other boy nodded in reply and pulled out one of the arrows and tossed it to Gisli. Look, he said, holding it up for Myra and Asa to see. At first glance it appeared just like any arrow, but then Myra noticed that there was no barbed head at the end of the shaft. Instead the shaft bulged out to form a knotted lump. This won't kill but it will hurt, said Gisli, rubbing his shoulder as he spoke. I bet it does, said Asa as he took hold of the blunted arrow and turned it over in his hands. Your friend will find out for himself soon enough, said Gisli. What, you mean Daniel? Asked Myra. Yes, replied Gisli, it's part of the initiation to become a member of the fur. All new novices must go through the trials. You mean Crest is going to shoot him with this? Asked Asa, holding up the blunted arrow. He'll be wearing both his mail and gambeson, said Gisli. He'll be perfectly fine. Will he have anything else? Asked Myra. A shield? No. No shield, answered Gisli, but he will be wearing his helmet. This did little to comfort Myra. I'm glad I'm not joining this fur, chuckled Asa. Myra cringed. She didn't like the idea of the Arthurian boys shooting Daniel while he was unable to defend himself. It sounded too much like a firing squad to her. What other trials will Daniel have to do? Asked Asa. You said trials earlier, so I assume that there are more than one. Well, Daniel has already passed the trials of strength and bravery, said Gisli, the first when he beat Eric in their duel and the second when he shot the winged serpent in the eye with his sling. What are the others? Myra asked. Well, there is the test of endurance, the test of speed, the trial of loyalty and the ordeal of the blood. This last name made Myra feel afraid for Daniel's safety. Anything that had blood in the title was a bad sign, as far as she was concerned. So the test of endurance is getting shot with this? Asked Asa, holding up the arrow. Among other things, yes, answered Gisli. As they spoke, Daniel was only just learning of these trials for himself. His face turned pale when he was told that he was going to be shot. If this is over not joining in the hunt last night, I'm sorry, he cried. Beatrice grabbed me and wouldn't let me go. I couldn't get away. I'm not a coward. I know you're not, said Crest reassuringly. This is just a test to see how much you can take before you call for us to stop. So you're basically hazing him? Asked Jason, who was listening in on their conversation. Yes, answered Crest, turning to face Jason. And you all went through it? He asked. The Arthurian boys nodded. All of you? Asked Daniel. We just said so, said Crest. And did it hurt? Asked Daniel. Of course it hurts, laughed Eric. The trick is not minding that it hurts. Sounds like something that happened to me when I joined the militia, said Jason. You mean your comrade shot you with that? Asked Crest, motioning to the pistol that was holstered at Jason's side. Hell no, replied Jason, they didn't shoot me. If they had, I wouldn't be talking to you now. They dumped a bucket of ice water over my head and made me run the obstacle course while blindfolded and crawling backwards. Also, it was the middle of the night. Also, it was early April and freezing. Why would they make you do that? Asked Crest, confusion washing over his face. It's a tradition among the militiamen, answered Jason, goes back 40 years or so. Don't ask me who came up with it or why they did, because I honestly don't know. If I did know who it was, I'd wring his neck with my bare hands. Jason shuddered as he recalled the event. It had been very unpleasant when he had experienced it, but he remembered laughing and joking about it afterwards with his friends who had also endured it alongside him. Alongside me, he thought as he looked down at Daniel. Oh brother, the things I do for you, cousin, he said. He looked at Crest and said, shoot me too. You? Asked Crest. Yes, me, repeated Jason, I'm not going to let you shoot Danny boy otherwise. Daniel gaped at his cousin for a few seconds as he processed this. You'd do that for me? He asked once he regained his composure. Sure, what are cousins for? He replied, besides, if we both get shot, B would have to get angry at both of us instead of just me for letting this happen. Daniel had to admit that this logic seemed reasonable. Although he believed that his sister would have been mad at both of them in any event. Still, the idea of Jason taking the hits right there beside him made him feel not as anxious as he did when Crest had first told him. He knew at any rate that if Beatrice hadn't gone off with Mrs. Draconis earlier, she would be putting a stop to this test. Daniel suddenly wished that he had gone with them. All right, Master Jason, said Crest, I shall accept your offer. Great, said Jason, when's the execution? Right now, if you wish, said Eric, stringing his longbow. Let's get this over with, said Daniel, feeling his heart sink into his boots as he looked at the blunted arrows and longbows. Very well, said Crest, stand over there. The two Argonauts stood 30 feet away from the bowmen. They stood next to each other, bracing themselves for the impacts. What's it like? Asked Daniel. What's what like? Said Jason. Getting shot, said Daniel. You've been shot before, how does it feel? Daniel, I've only been shot with bullets before, not arrows, Jason replied as he began to regret his decision to go through this ordeal with his cousin. But you must have some idea, said Daniel. Well, I can tell you this much, said Jason. Notch! Cried Crest. The bowmen fitted the blunted arrows to their bowstrings. I don't recommend it, continued Jason. What was it like, your first time? Asked Daniel, his slightly tremoring voice betraying his nervousness. Bloody painful, replied Jason. Draw! Yelled Crest. The bowmen drew back their bowstrings and took aim for Daniel and Jason. Nice knowing you, Danny boy, said Jason, bracing himself. You too, replied Daniel, screwing his eyes shut. Don't aim for my face, guys, called Jason, it's my only redeeming feature. Loose! Boomed Crest. The bowmen released their grips on their bowstrings. The arrows whistled through the air as they sailed towards their two targets. Jason was struck full in the chest by 3 of the missiles, knocking the wind out of him. He collapsed to his knees, groaning. Daniel hadn't fared much better, he had caught 5 arrows in the chest while a 6th had dinged off his helmet. He lay on his back looking up at the clear sky. You okay? Jason asked with a slight effort. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that his chest was black and blue with bruises. Ugh, was all Daniel could reply at the moment. Well done, said Crest as he and the others jogged up to them. I passed? Asked Daniel, looking up at his friend. With flying colors, replied Crest, offering him his hand. Daniel took it and was pulled back onto his feet. You dropped like a sack of stones, laughed Eric. We all did when we were first shot, said Crest. My chest is broken, groaned Daniel. It can't be, said one of the other boys, you're wearing your gambeson. Well, it feels like it, replied Daniel as he turned to the bonfire. Myra had watched the performance with a mixture of disgust and interest. She thought it was stupid that Daniel had to be shot in order for him to become a full member of the Fur. But at the same time she enjoyed seeing him flopping to the ground like a scarecrow blown over by a stiff breeze. Boys are so stupid sometimes, she said as she watched Daniel and Jason approach the fire. Yes, they can be very stupid at times, said Tilla, who sat next to the she-elf. We're not stupid, said Asa, who was reclining beside them. I said sometimes, Asa, said Myra, not all the time. Although there are days when I think that you boys are born stupid. And there are some days when I think that all girls are born stupid, retorted Asa. Peace, giggled Tilla, throwing up her hands. Let's agree that both boys and girls are equally stupid at times. Both Myra and Asa nodded and looked at each other. They smiled and laughed. Daniel walked up to them and sat down heavily next to Asa. You okay? Asked Asa. Daniel looked at him and groaned, rubbing his aching chest. I feel like someone punched me, he said, then added, while wearing a cast-iron boxing glove. It's your own fault for going along with it, said Myra, you'll get no sympathy from me. I didn't expect any from you, he replied with a wincing chuckle. At that moment the little dragon whelpling walked up to them and chirped loudly. He stamped his three-toed clawed feet and gazed down at them. What do you want, Scrap? Asked Myra. The young dragon looked at Myra and barked like a dog, demanding attention or food, or both. What's wrong, buddy? Asked Daniel, stroking the whelpling's neck. The dragon uttered a low growl and shook off Daniel's hand. He squawked and stomped the ground impatiently. What do you want? Asked Asa, none of us speak dragon. The whelpling shot Asa a look that seemed to say, well of course you don't speak dragon. I think he just wants someone to play with him, said Myra. She looked into his big mischief-filled eyes and smiled. Is that what you want? She asked. The whelpling flapped his wings and nodded his head fervently. Myra stood up and followed the whelpling who had turned away from the group. The little dragon began to walk off into the grasslands when he became aware that the others were also following him. This simply wouldn't do. He turned around sharply, placed himself between his beloved Myra and the others, bared his teeth and claws and hissed up at Asa, Daniel and Tilla. The three of them quickly backed away. Scrap, cried Myra, that's not very nice. The whelpling looked over his shoulder at the she-elf and made an apologetic whining sound. Look, Scrap, said Daniel stepping forward, if you wanted to play with, he never finished. The whelpling whipped his head around and snarled at the male-clad boy. Daniel recoiled and almost jumped out of his skin. The little dragon's teeth looked very sharp. I guess he just wants to play with me alone, said Myra with a diffident look to the others. You two have fun, said Daniel. He turned around and beat a hasty retreat. Asa and Tilla soon followed after him. They knew better than to argue with a dragon, even a very young dragon. When they were gone the whelpling turned around and gazed up at Myra, his eyes beaming with glee. At last he had her all to himself. His Myra. He smiled. But Myra didn't return the smile, she looked down at him with annoyance marring her soft elven features. That was very rude, Scrap, she said, shaking her head at him. You shouldn't have done that. But I want you all alone, thought the whelpling, I want you all for myself. Myra knelt down in front of him, combing back a lock of red hair behind a pointed ear with her fingers. She looked at him with the wonderful sky-blue eyes that made his heart hammer uncontrollably with infatuation and love. He wagged his long stiff tail and panted like a puppy dog. If you wanted me to play with you, she said, you should have let the others play too. It's only fair that way. But the others aren't in love with you, thought the whelpling, moping his head. Myra placed her hand under his scaly chin and lifted his head. Are you sorry? She asked. The whelpling nodded with a penitent look in his eyes. He truly was sorry, he saw that he had caused Myra distress and he was ashamed of himself for doing so. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable but he had to make the others back away. It had been the only way for them to be alone and he was sorry. Myra saw the remorse in his eyes and smiled at him. Good, she said, can the others play with us too? The whelpling's eyes hardened and he shook his horned head emphatically. He wouldn't suffer any rivals for Myra's attention. No, he thought as he gazed up at her, no, no, no. I want you all alone with me. Me. The whelpling made a strange yammering whining sound and shook his head again. Well why not? Asked Myra. The whelpling backed away, tugging at her skirt as he did so. He looked over his shoulder at the grasslands beyond and back at Myra. Follow me, he thought as he pulled at her. All right, I'm coming, she relented. The whelpling stopped clawing at the hem of her dress and yapped excitedly. He wagged his long thin tail like a dog and looked up at her, grinning from ear to ear. He spun around and trotted away. He stopped and looked back expectantly at her. She trailed along behind him and the little whelpling chirped. He led her out into the grassy expanse far from the others. Nearby a herd of cattle was grazing on the thick turf. The lead bull looked up when he sensed the whelpling, a brass bell jangling and clanging under his thick neck. His eyes narrowed and he pawed the ground but judged the little dragon to not be a threat. The big bovine snorted, jets of steam rattling the brass ring in his nose. When the whelpling and the she-elf were far enough away the bull resumed chewing his cud. Once the pair were a few hundred yards away from the smoldering bonfire, the whelpling stopped and turned around. He looked up at Myra and made a series of yapping and chirping sounds. Every now and then he would flap his wings or stamp his feet into the springy grass as if to emphasize some important point. Myra had no idea what he was trying to tell her, but she stood there patiently and waited for the little dragon to finish his utterance, nodding every now and then as if to agree with whatever it was that he was saying. After a few minutes of this, the whelpling stopped chattering and gazed up at the she-elf, his big eyes shining. "I wish I knew what you just said to me," said Myra as she scratched him under his scaly chin. The whelpling closed his eyes and purred when Myra did this. He shuddered with delight and gazed up at the girl. Myra smiled and knelt down before him and began patting him like a dog. The little dragon smiled. Suddenly he moved forward, forcing Myra to sit down on the grass. He rubbed his scaly body up against her and purred loudly. "Easy scrap," giggled Myra as she half-heartedly tried to fend him off. The whelpling chirped and wrapped his wings around her and licked her soft warm cheek. He gazed into her sky-blue eyes and thought, "I love you. I will always love you." The little dragon felt his heart hammering in his chest every time he looked at her. He knew that this was love. It had to be love. True pure love. He had never felt like this before. True, he had known what love was, he had felt it for his mother, his late father and his uncle Amaron, but that was familiar love between family members. This sensation that made him feel both brave and terrified at once was so strange and yet so intoxicating at the same time. He remembered when he had first felt like this. A few weeks ago he and his mother had attempted to fly into Empire City, the Sulian Empire's capital city, in order for Myra to find Asa, the helper who was prophesied to find the Dragon King alongside her. The whelpling remembered that they had intended to sneak into the Dark City without alerting anyone, but they had been discovered and shot down. The little dragon and his mother had been badly wounded and forced to hide in dark, damp sewers for days. During all that time he had been in constant pain and had screamed and screamed until his voice was hoarse and his throat was raw. The whelpling had thought that he would be in agony for the rest of his life. But then a miracle happened. His cries had drawn Myra to him, and when she saw how badly hurt he was, she had placed her hands on him and his wounds had closed up, his pain vanishing without a trace. The whelpling remembered how dumbfounded he had been when he saw what she had done to him, and he also remembered his elation and joy when he looked up at Myra and saw her grinning down at him. That had been the moment when he realized that he loved her, and what's more, he reasoned that she loved him too. Why else would she have healed him? Why else would she smile at him every time she looked at him? Why else would she be so affectionate towards him? She loved him and he loved her too. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. The whelpling smiled and laid down on the grass, coiling his tail around Myra to hold her in place. He rested his head on her lap and closed his eyes contentedly. Myra looked down at the little dragon and stroked his head. "You are too cute," she giggled. The whelpling smiled as he began to fall asleep. As he drifted off, he dreamed of the life he and Myra would have together. They would live far away, maybe high in the mountains where they could look down on the world, or deep in the forest where the shadows of the trees concealed a realm of eternal twilight. And if Myra didn't like those places, they could dwell in the peaceful country of the Agro-Caelestes once the Sulians had been driven out of course. The whelpling could see it all. He and Myra would spend the rest of their lives together, happy and satisfied. True, they would need to take some things into consideration. Myra's lack of wings and fire breath, for example, would certainly prove problematic. But she was his true love, and he would carry her when they had to fly and breathe fire for her when the need arose. He would be her wings and fire. He would be her everything, just as she was his everything. He smiled and purred in pleasure at the thought.